Mark 15, the silence of the king. The morning coffee had gone lukewarm in their mugs by the time the small study group reached the final chapters of the second gospel. 4 open Bibles sat on the low oak table inside the church annex, surrounded by highlighters and scrawled notebook margins. Nathan, adjusting his glasses, leaned forward to ground the room as they opened to the final trial. "All right, let's step into Mark chapter 15, verse 1, he said, his voice quiet but deliberate. Notice how the setting changes instantly at dawn. The Sanhedrin binds Jesus and delivers him straight to Pontius Pilate. We are shifting from a religious trial about blasphemy to a brutal civil trial for high treason against Rome." Chloe traced her finger down the text, her brow furrowing as she looked at the immediate interaction. "It's the title Pilate uses that gets me," she murmured. "He doesn't ask if Jesus is a religious leader. He asks, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' It's pure politics." Austin nodded, his thumb resting on a Greek lexicon he'd been parsing before the session started. "And look at Jesus' response in verse 2, Austin pointed out, leaning in. He says, "Sungleis, you have said so." It sounds almost evasive in English, but the grammar is doing something incredibly specific under the hood. The pronoun ee is completely redundant in Greek. The verb already contains the word you. By explicitly shouting that pronoun first, Jesus is putting the definition back on Pilate. He's saying, "You are the one using that Roman military word for king, not me." The group moved steadily through the dark progression of the morning hours, the crowd shouting for Barabbas, the execution of the political sentence, and the raw brutality inside the governor's headquarters. Nathan paused at verse 16, highlighting the detail where the Roman soldiers gathered the entire battalion inside the praetorium. "They aren't just beating him," Nathan noted, looking around the circle. "They are staging a satirical imperial triumph, the purple cloak, the twisted crown of thorns, the mock salutations. It's Rome mocking the very idea that a bound, bleeding peasant could claim a kingdom. They lead him out to Golgotha, nail him between 2 insurgents, and even put the formal charge over his head as a public warning to anyone else who challenges Caesar." The room grew noticeably quieter as the narrative reached the 6th hour, when a supernatural darkness blanked out the Mediterranean sun until the 9th hour. Julian, who had been waiting restlessly with his notebook open, tapped his pen against verse 34. "This is the moment right here," Julian said enthusiastically, looking at the others. "When Jesus cries out, 'Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani,' this is the ultimate proof that Jesus spoke Aramaic exclusively. It's his native, raw cry from the cross, and Mark has to literally translate it for the Greek readers because it's the only language Jesus used to communicate his deepest thoughts." Austin smiled patiently, leaning back in his chair to widen the lens. "It's an incredibly raw moment, Julian, but the linguistic reality on the ground was actually much bigger than just Aramaic," Austin explained gently. First-century Judea was a dense, multilingual crossroads. Aramaic was definitely the domestic vernacular of the common people, but Hebrew was the language of the temple liturgies and scribal debates, which is why Jesus is actually quoting the opening of Psalm chapter 22 here. On top of that, Koine Greek was the language of commerce, administration, and government, and Latin was stamped on every legal military document Rome carried. Jesus grew up in a Galilee surrounded by international trade routes. He navigated all of these languages fluidly depending on who he was speaking to. Julian paused, looking back down at his Bible. "But if he's quoting scripture, why did the onlookers think he was calling for Elijah?" Chloe asked, leaning in to look over Julian's shoulder. "Because of the phonetic confusion," Austin answered, pointing to the transliteration. In original liturgical Hebrew, Psalm chapter 22 starts with Eli, Eli, which sounds exactly like the name Elijah. But Jesus cries out in the regional Aramaic pronunciation, Eloi, Eloi. The bystanders, already caught in a chaotic, dark environment, completely misunderstand the dialect. Mark explicitly puts the translation in the text because his audience, primarily Roman Christians, would have been completely lost without it. He wanted them to hear the raw, acoustic reality of the distress, but he needed the translation to show that Jesus wasn't calling for a prophetic rescue. He was declaring the fulfillment of the suffering righteous man from the Psalms. Austin leaned forward, tapping the table to execute a connection he had mapped out earlier. "And honestly, now that we are talking about languages, let's go back to verse 2 also," he said, guiding the group's eyes back up the page. When Pilate interrogates Jesus at the start of the chapter, they aren't using a translator. Pilate, a Roman governor, doesn't speak Aramaic, and Jesus isn't speaking Latin. They are communicating directly in Koine Greek, the language of the state trial. That's why that emphasis on sengleis matters so much. Jesus is responding fluidly to a Roman official in the empire's legal tongue, masterfully holding his own ground while completely redefining the linguistic terms of the trial. Nathan watched the realization settle into the room, marking the text with a quiet nod of approval. "It shows he isn't a passive victim caught in a system he doesn't understand," Nathan said. From the Greek interrogation with Pilate to the Aramaic cry of fulfillment, he is deliberately moving through the cross. The study moved into the final, striking shift of the chapter, where the institutional noise of Roman soldiers and mocking priests finally fades away. Chloe cleared her throat to read the closing verses, her voice slowing down as she reached the burial. "The text says there were women looking on from a distance," she read, "among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome." And then at the very end, in verse 47, it says they saw exactly where he was laid. Chloe closed her Bible, looking up at the group. "Think about the structural irony here," she said softly. "The male disciples, the ones who argued along the road about who was the greatest, the ones who promised they would die for him, have completely vanished into the night. The narrative focus shifts entirely to these women. Mark uses the exact technical Greek words for true discipleship here, pikoluthon for following and the ikonon for serving, to describe what they had been doing since Galilee. They didn't just show up for the execution, they were the financial and relational backbone of the movement." Nathan leaned forward, bringing the morning's research to its definitive anchor point. "And by tracking the body straight to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, they provide something the ancient world desperately needed: unbroken eyewitness continuity," he concluded. In a culture where a woman's testimony wasn't even admissible in a formal court of law, God chooses them to log the precise geographical coordinates of the burial site. They ensure that nobody can claim the early church just went to the wrong grave on Sunday morning. The institutions of power thought they had cleanly sealed a dead insurgent behind a rolled stone, but these women were sitting in the shadows, quietly auditing the layout, waiting for the dawn.